In American schools, children are taught to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. This simple oath of loyalty may not seem controversial, but to the Amish it conflicts with their basic religious beliefs. To most people, the Amish are simply a quaint group of farmers who dress in old-fashioned clothes. However, in 1972, 3 Amish fathers were at the center of a national conflict. At stake was the issue of whether a state's interest in compulsory education took precedence over a parent's interest in educating his child according to deeply held religious beliefs. The Supreme Court's decision in Wisconsin v. Yoder allowed the Amish to educate their own children and set the precedent that homeschooling was a legal alternative to the public school system. For the Amish, the effects of the court case were mixed. While they were free to educate their children without state harassment, the very act of engaging in civil conflict was seen by many as contrary to their pacifist principles. The Amish are Anabaptists who have their roots in the Radical Reformation that took place less than a decade after the Protestant Reformation in 1517. Anabaptists do not consider themselves to be either Protestant or Catholic. They are distinguished by their rejection of infant baptism in favor of adult or believer baptism, and their refusal to pledge allegiance to any authority other than God. This was viewed as a dangerous form of anarchy that led to the persecution in both Catholic and Protestant lands. Memories of the Anabaptist martyrs who would not compromise their faith remain strong within the community even to this day. For the first decade of its existence, the Anabaptist movement had little cohesion, and some Anabaptists expressed a violence that culminated in the Munster Rebellion of 1534. The following year, a Dutch Catholic priest named Menno Simons converted to Anabaptism and declared the use of violence to be unbiblical. He gave Anabaptism a theological foundation based on pacifism. In 1693, the Anabaptists of Switzerland schismed over the issue of shunning, a form of excommunication from the church. The followers of Jacob Ammon, who advocated for the stricter interpretation, are today called the Amish. The Amish practice a more radical form of separation from the world than any other contemporary Anabaptist group. They base their lives on the doctrine that good Christians should surrender their will to God and live simply and plainly in cooperation with each other. For many years, schooling in rural America took the form of the one-room schoolhouse. Most Amish families were content to send their children to such schools, but after 8th grade they believed their children should remain in the community to practice the Amish way of life and work on the family farm.
Both my parents grew up in Amish families, and my mother was living in Ohio when she was in grade school, and when she got to the 8th grade, she thought her school days were over. That was the norm. The Amish kids went to school through 8th grade. So the next year, she didn't go to school, and then the truant officer came around and said, "Oh, the law is now that you have to go to school till you're 16." And her parents didn't challenge that, and so my mother went to school until she was 16, got through, I think, 2.5 years of high school.
However, in 1960, 9 Amish fathers from Honeybrook, West Virginia were jailed for 5 days for refusing to send their children to high school. 5 years later, Amish children in Hazleton, Iowa were photographed running into a cornfield to escape from being forcibly bused to a district school. From the point of view of the Amish, the world was once again persecuting them for refusing to compromise their beliefs. In 1966, the small town of New Glarus, Wisconsin had only a few thousand residents. Among them were several Amish families who had moved to the area looking for affordable farmland. Like most of their faith, the New Glarus Amish did not send their children to school after 8th grade. This was generally overlooked by the school authorities, despite it being a violation of the state's compulsory education law. However, in the summer of 1968, the Amish of New Glarus decided to build their own schools, which created a problem for the public schools in town. Funding for the public schools was based on a per-student enrollment, and the loss of the Amish children would cost the New Glarus school system $18,000. In an attempt to get around the financial loss, the New Glarus school superintendent Kenneth Gelwin asked the Amish families to enroll their children in the public school until the 3rd Friday of the year so that they would be counted as pupils. The Amish, being honest, balked at this proposal and refused to participate. In retaliation, school authorities began to investigate Amish families who they believed were not complying with the state's compulsory education laws. The truant officer found at least 7 children who had ceased to attend either Amish or public schools at the age of 14. In November of 1968, Greene County District Attorney Lois Koenig filed formal charges against Jonas Yoder, Wallace Miller, and Aidan Yutzi for failing to comply with the law. Despite being taken to court, the Amish were reluctant to hire a lawyer. In keeping with their faith, they believed in passive non-resistance even when wrongly accused. However, when realizing that they were in for a protracted legal process, they accepted the offer of counsel from the National Amish Committee of Religious Freedom. The lawyer who would defend the three Amish fathers was William Ball, who had worked on the Loving v. Virginia case. Despite Ball's impassioned defense of the First Amendment rights of the Amish, the Greene County Court judge convicted the fathers, ordering each of them to pay a fine of $5. Ball appealed for a new trial, but the men were once more convicted. Determined to make this a First Amendment case, Ball appealed to the state Supreme Court in Madison, Wisconsin. Remarkably, the court agreed to hear the case on December 1, 1970. During the trial, Ball argued that if the court upheld the same ruling as the lower courts, it would, quote, sound the death knell to the old order Amish way of life in Wisconsin. After weeks of trial, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Amish, deeming that it was unconstitutional for the state to enforce school attendance when it conflicted with religious dogma. The Amish all across the state rejoiced, but their celebrations were short-lived. The state appealed the case to the highest authority they could, the United States Supreme Court. The appeal did not fall on deaf ears. The United States Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, and the trial took place December 8, 1971. The state's main argument was that of precedence. In previous cases, states had the right to regulate education and enforce attendance. They also cited the majority opinion in Bromfield v. Brown, in which the court discussed how states might play favorites by allowing religious objectors to be exempt from laws. Serving as the lawyer for the Amish, William Ball once more fought on their behalf. He argued that there was no compelling interest in requiring an Amish child to continue school after 14, pointing out that the state had not produced a single shred of evidence for it. Ball also brought to the court's attention the doctrine of separation that was a core tenet of the Amish faith, saying, "The Amish do not want their children, and they do not want themselves to be exposed
to the spirit of luxury, of ostentation, of strife, consumerism, competition, speed, violence, other such elements as are commonly found in our American life. Therefore, education for them embraces a rejection of the higher learning and a positive emphasis upon the learning of the agricultural life. It rejects the concept of exposure to and service in the ways of the world. And when you add to this the factor of adolescence, you'll see why an Amish person, whether we would agree with him or not, may not, from a religious point of view, attend school beyond the 8th grade."
After closing remarks from the state, the waiting game began. It was not until May 15, 1972, that the world heard the verdict.
In a unanimous ruling, the Supreme Court has upheld the right of Amish parents to keep their children out of school after the 8th grade, in spite of compulsory attendance laws to the contrary. The court said the Amish, a devout religious sect, had shown their sincerity in their 250 years, and noted that the ruling for them does not apply to newly created groups.
The majority opinion was delivered by Chief Justice Warren Burger and touched especially on the fact that the Amish were a well-established and centuries-old religion, and that the 2 years of public schooling that the Amish did not attend would not make a positive impact on their lives.
And I remember reading in Time magazine that the case was settled in the Supreme Court. I was really surprised, and that it was in favor of the Amish being able to have their own private schools. And what I didn't realize was the conflict that caused within the Amish community, that they were divided over whether they had done the right thing in pursuing this in the courts.
The Amish are staunch pacifists, and some among them believe that Jonas Yoder had gone too far. They felt that by taking the matter to court, he had practiced violence and used force, even if it was in his own defense. Some of the more conservative Amish believed that Yoder fighting this case was a sign of the impending destruction of the old order Amish, and in New Glarus, the bishop and senior minister of the Amish church deserted the community out of shame. The most influential result of the Yoder case was the emergence of homeschooling. Prior to Yoder, parents and communities who would wish to homeschool their children faced the same issues as the Amish. However, after the court ruled in favor of Yoder, parents who wished to homeschool their children for religious reasons in particular had a strong legal ground upon which to stand. The homeschool movement has been on the rise, with the most recent data from 2012 showing that over 1.77 million students are now homeschooled, and with an increase in 18% from 2007, there are no signs of these numbers slowing down. The Yoder case is a good example of how in a pluralistic society, the state may need to compromise its enforcement of even well-meaning laws when they come into conflict with the First Amendment rights of individuals or marginal groups whose values differ from the majority population.